Derek Holloway was 39 years old and had spent 11 years building a life his wife only knew how to admire when it suited her. He drove a used silver Camry, wore work boots with polished steel toes, and kept his hands busy even on Sundays, because men who came up the hard way learned to stay useful. He had a modest brick house, a steady job as a civil engineer, and a quiet way of moving through the world that made people underestimate him on sight. That night he pulled into his own driveway and saw the front door open only 4 inches, the chain still latched, while Marissa stood there in a black dress she had not worn for him, and a calm expression that did not belong to any wife welcoming her husband home. Behind her, in the yellow hallway light, Derek caught the shape of a man's jacket on the chair by the stairs and the glint of a second phone in her hand, tilted away from him as if even the screen had something to hide. She smiled like a person delivering news she had rehearsed, and then she said the words that would have broken a lesser man. I chose the better man. What Marissa did not know was that Derek had built more than roads and retaining walls in his life, and the man she was trying to dismiss at the doorstep had spent years learning how to outweight people who thought patience was weakness. In the pocket of his jacket was a slim black folder with bank statements, property filings, and one quiet detail she had never thought to ask about, because she had mistaken his silence for surrender. What happened next would cost her everything she believed she had already stolen. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The coffee was still hot when Derek stood in the kitchen the next morning, looking through the window at the maple tree he had planted with his own hands 3 summers earlier. The yard was still damp from a light rain, and the new retaining wall along the back edge of the property held the soil exactly as he had designed it to hold, line by line, pressure by pressure. His father used to say, tools were meant to work, not shine, and Derek had lived by that longer than he had lived with Marissa. He liked things that carried weight and stayed true under it. She came in wearing soft gray and that same careful smile she used when she wanted to seem affectionate without actually giving anything away. She kissed his cheek, let her fingers rest briefly on his shoulder, and asked if he had slept. Her voice was warm enough to pass, but the perfume was new, and the phone she carried stayed angled toward her palm. Derek noticed both, and he said nothing. He remembered the first time he met her. It had been at a community fundraiser in a church hall on the west side, where he had gone because a friend had asked him to help inspect a cracked service entrance before the event started. Marissa had been working the registration table with a tired but easy smile, and when a child spilled punch near the doorway, she had crouched down without complaint and helped clean it up while laughing at herself for nearly slipping. She had seemed practical then, grounded, someone who knew how to stay kind under pressure. For a long time, she had been exactly that. Derek had admired the way she listened, the way she made ordinary rooms feel lighter, and for a while he believed he had found a woman who understood the value of quiet effort. By the time they married, he had already finished the graduate program she never quite understood, though she knew enough to brag about the salary when it suited her, and enough to minimize the rest when it did not. He drove an old Camry because he preferred it, wore plain shirts because they fit, and kept his life organized in ways that looked modest to anyone who did not understand the difference between being simple and being hidden. He had paid off the house early. He had also put money into a set of private holdings through a trust his lawyer managed. Marissa knew about none of it. She knew enough to live comfortably, and not enough to know she was living beside a man she had already underestimated. That afternoon, as he was tightening a loose hinge on the back gate, he got a text from his supervisor about a delayed site review, and along with it came a missed call from an unfamiliar number. The number rang once, then again. He ignored it at first. Then the second call came, and he looked at the screen long enough to feel the shape of trouble before it arrived. Some men mistake quiet for emptiness. When he found the proof, he found it the way men like him found most things, by noticing what did not fit. Marissa had left her tablet on the coffee table while she showered. The screen was unlocked, a message preview still open from a contact saved only as Jay. The message was brief, careless, and intimate in the way that only people who have become too comfortable can be careless. He did not touch the device at first. He looked around the room, listened to the water running upstairs, and then took out his own phone. His hands did not shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He took photos of the message, of the contact name, of the timestamp. Then he opened the email linked to her tablet and saw a thread of deleted receipts, hotel confirmations, and calendar entries hidden behind generic names. One date repeated itself in 3 different places over 9 months. Another name kept appearing in the background of transaction notifications. Marissa had been moving money in small, patterned withdrawals, not enough to trigger an alarm on their joint account, but enough to leave a trail for anyone patient enough to follow it. $34,000 over 18 months. One transfer at a time. One lie at a time. He sat down at the dining table and kept going, because once the first piece of evidence is found, the rest usually wants to be seen. He found a second phone in the laundry room, tucked inside a folded jacket he had not worn in weeks. It was cheap, anonymous, and loaded with messages he had not been meant to read. There were references to a lease, to a downtown apartment, to a weekend trip she had described to him as a retreat with girlfriends. There was also one photograph, snapped in a restaurant he had never heard of Marissa across the table from a man in a tailored coat with his hand resting near hers. The image did not show affection. It showed coordination. It showed planning. Derek copied everything. He forwarded emails to a private account. He downloaded bank statements. He saved receipts, screenshots, and account histories into a folder labeled in a way that would mean nothing to anyone else. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of water upstairs, and he felt the truth settle into place with the heavy precision of poured concrete. By the time Marissa came downstairs in a fresh blouse, asking casually what he wanted for dinner, he already knew more than she did. He made one decision before the sun went down. He opened his laptop, created a new folder, and named it with her full name. Start at the beginning. Do not skip steps. His lawyer, Patricia Bell, had the kind of voice that made people lower theirs without noticing. She was 60, sharp as a drafting knife, and she read through the printed pages on her desk without a single change in expression. Derek sat across from her in a charcoal shirt and clean work boots, looking like exactly the sort of man the room would have ignored if he had not arrived with evidence. "Is it enough?" he asked. "It is more than enough," Patricia said, tapping the stack once with one finger. "She is not improvising. She has been building a case against your marriage while pretending to participate in it." That was the only validation he needed. He nodded once and let the silence do the rest. An hour later, he was in the kitchen with his aunt, Viola, the woman who had raised him after his mother died, standing over a pot of collard greens like she was still guarding the whole family from bad luck. She looked through the printed statements, shook her head slowly, and made the small sound of disgust older women reserve for people who mistake greed for intelligence. She thought he was what? Viola asked. A man with a modest house and a steady paycheck. Viola gave him a long look. "Boy, your father used to say a man should never confuse being quiet with being unprepared." Derek smiled a little at that, because it sounded like something his father would have said from the porch in the late evening, after the tools were put away and the day had settled down. He carried that line with him as he built the rest of his case. The counter-evidence came in layers. Patricia found forged signatures on one of the mortgage-related forms Marissa had tried to file. A forensic accountant identified payment patterns that pointed to a hidden debt tied to her lover. A man named Evan Cross, who had already been turned down twice for business loans, and was using Marissa's money to keep a failing consultancy from collapsing. There were invoices that did not match services rendered, a pattern of expense reports tied to dinners and hotels, and one transfer chain that showed the two of them had been draining his joint assets into accounts they thought he would never notice. Derek kept working his normal job, kept answering emails, kept driving home in the same Camry, and kept kissing Marissa on the cheek when she came close enough to expect it. She asked him questions about his day. He answered them. She talked about a friend's birthday party. He listened. She had no idea he already knew about the apartment downtown, the separate cell line, the calls to a mediator, or the fact that Patricia had begun preparing a legal package that would freeze every move she thought she had already made. He ate dinner quietly. He watched television beside her. He looked like a man in his own life. He was watching. 3 days passed. By Friday morning, Patricia called and told him to come in early. The last piece had arrived, and it changed the shape of everything. Evan Cross had been using a forged authorization to route funds into a shell account under a business name that existed only on paper. The account had been active for 10 months. The money trail led through 3 banks and ended in a property lease with Marissa's signature on the emergency contact form. There was no reasonable explanation now, only a clean path. Derek sat in Patricia's office and looked at the final pages. She folded her hands and said, "When she walks into that room, she will think she is here to talk about a divorce negotiation. What she is actually walking into is a record." He answered with a nod. The meeting was set for Monday at a conference room in Patricia's building, a quiet space with a long glass table and a city view that made everyone inside look smaller than they were. Marissa arrived first, wearing cream and confidence, followed by Evan in a navy suit that fit him too well to be borrowed. They were expecting a procedural meeting. They found Derek already seated, his aunt beside him, Patricia at the head of the table, and a thick stack of documents arranged in front of each chair. Marissa laughed once, lightly, as if the setup were a misunderstanding. "What is this supposed to be?" Patricia slid the first folder across the table. "It is your financial trail." The color left Evan's face in stages. First surprise, then irritation, then the first edge of fear when he saw the bank records. Derek did not move. He placed a printed screenshot beside the statement, then another, then the forged authorization, then the apartment lease, then the hotel receipts, then the audit summary with names, dates, and amounts laid out in a clean, unarguable sequence. Marissa's mouth opened, then closed. She reached for a page, saw her own signature on it, and pulled her hand back as if it had been burned. Patricia said, "You were never dealing with a man who needed your permission to survive." That was the identity reveal, plain and final. Derek had not just been an engineer with a steady job. He was the principal owner of the development firm, funding 3 municipal projects in the county. The man behind the trust that had quietly held the house in a protective structure for years, and the man who had already moved the relevant assets into a separate legal shield 2 weeks before she ever knew the net was closing. He had built infrastructure for a living, and now she understood that the same mind that knew how to prevent a bridge from failing also knew how to keep a marriage from taking the only thing it wanted from him. Marissa's eyes filled, but not with remorse, with panic. "You can fix this," she said quickly. "Derek, we can fix this." It was a mistake. Viola leaned back in her chair and spoke before Derek had to. "Baby, mistakes are accidents. This was a plan." Marissa turned to him then, trying the old voice, the soft one, the one that used to make him forgive things too quickly. "I chose the better man because I thought you would never fight for anything." Derek looked at her for a long moment and then placed both hands flat on the table. "I am not angry," he said. "I am clear. Those are different things." He stood, gathered his folder, and nodded once to Patricia. The room went still as he walked out. No one followed. No one called after him. The paperwork remained on the table, arranged in the exact order her life had begun to fail. 6 months later, Derek stood on the back porch of a renovated home 10 miles away, looking out over a garden he and a woman named Renee had planted together in early spring. She was a hospital administrator with a calm voice and an honest way of asking questions. And she had never once mistaken his silence for weakness. The tomatoes were heavy on the vine, the deckboards were warm under his feet, and the new workshop behind the house held his tools in clean rows. His company had just finished a contract worth $8 million, and he was spending less time proving himself than he had in years. Marissa was gone from the life he knew. Her office role had disappeared after the internal audit exposed the missing funds. Evan Cross had filed bankruptcy after the shell company collapsed and the lease was voided. Her mother had stopped taking her calls. Her sister had blocked her number. The people who once stood nearest to her had discovered, one by one, that loyalty has a memory. Derek heard the news from Patricia during a brief lunch meeting and did not react beyond a single nod. He had no use for gloating. He had already spent the better part of his life learning what to do with damage. That evening he watered the garden at dusk, then stood for a moment with the hose in one hand while the light faded across the fence. The air smelled like wet soil and cut grass. Renee called from inside to ask whether he wanted tea or coffee, and he answered tea without turning around. The porch light came on behind him, soft and steady, and he looked at the rows he had built, the life he had repaired, and the quiet that no longer felt temporary. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.